Over the last few years, I've dedicated a huge amount of my time and energy to learning everything I possibly can about the techniques and practices involved in producing 90s jungle. I honestly just find it absolutely fascinating, and at this point have read through pretty much every relevant forum and article and watched every YouTube video I can about this topic. The origins of this style were really born out of developments in computer technology in the 80s and 90s, where companies like Atari and Amiga were starting to make much more affordable machines. This also coincided with the birth of the hardware sampler, which further opened the door for hobbyists and home producers, as it allowed them to emulate much more expensive synths and multiple instruments from a single machine. A classic thing to do, which I will demonstrate in a second, is to sample a drum break from a record and then to run that through various bits of equipment like old analog mixers or guitar pedals or certain hardware samplers for their tonal qualities. This equipment was then often driven hard to produce more extreme saturation and colouring of the sound. Even though I used an aim and break in that example, I think there are probably 10 or 20 other classic breaks which are used over and over again in jungle tunes. And the Apache, the Funky Drummer, Soul Pride and probably the Think break are in my top tier of jungle breaks under the Amen. And if you want a more comprehensive list, there's actually an amazing Dogs on Acid post. I think it's called Hero Breaks, and I will put a link to that in the description. Now, this is a topic I have covered extensively on this channel, but if anyone wants a more in-depth look on this, I did a video quite recently doing drum break chopping for beginners in Amigo I would highly recommend checking out. All I want to say in this video today is there are two main camps for drum break chopping.
What's your name, boy?
I am Hando Jin, Hang Wong Sun.
Okay, great, so we've made it through the intro, and I think I will take this moment to say that this is actually the second time I've had to record this whole video. I did a take yesterday, which was probably one of the best recordings and performances I've ever given in my life, and I had the microphone turned away from me, and so all of the voice recording sounded so nasally, and I did all my sort of checks before recording, made sure all the levels were right, but even then sometimes when you're doing these videos you get stumped at the last hurdle, so I'm back again doing this today. Hopefully I've done a good sort of intro take there. This is the moment where we're going to start to dive into all the techniques, and we're going to begin with some classic break effects. Now, these things are actually quite simple techniques that you could do on these old hardware samplers, and they really make up 90% of the break effects that people were doing back in the 90s, apart from maybe a few artists like Dillinger and Photek who are really pushing the boat out. But I think, as you'll see from these examples, you can achieve quite a lot and get some very complex sounding breaks with some quite simple techniques. Okay, so we're going to start in Logic, and I'm going to very quickly show you how I like to chop breaks in here. Now, what I've got is that aim and break, which I processed earlier in running it through the AKAI and the Topaz mixer. And the first thing to do is to slice it up at all the transients. So you can zoom in, and just holding the marquee tool, I'm holding Command and double clicking to basically put slice markers in. Slice up this break at all of the hits, so all of the kicks and the snares and the shuffles. You basically put in slice markers everywhere. So you can see I've done that, and in this example below I've got a break which is fully sliced up. So the next step is to select the whole break and go right click, convert to new sampler track, and convert this. Okay, so let's bring this one up here so we can have them next to each other. After that, I'm actually going to do a little trick where I press Shift and Control and the down arrow. And what that's going to do is actually snap my playhead to the last audio region of this break. And what I want to do is trim up the MIDI of the Amen to perfectly align with the length of the audio region. For whatever reason, when you do convert to new sampler track, it creates all this blank MIDI that you don't really want. What you can then do is hold Alt and actually drag this MIDI region to perfectly fit with this 2-bar length. But can you see when I did that, it for some reason leaves this weird bit of MIDI where it doesn't properly warp it. So a better thing to do is press Command Alt and L and actually time stretch. That's like a hotkey to do the same thing, is to warp this MIDI region to fit with the cycle length. Now the reason I'm doing that is because I know that this is a 2-bar loop of the Amen at its original speed, but I want a 2-bar loop of the Amen at my project BPM of 166, and so I have to warp that MIDI to fit with my BPM. What this means is the Amen break is now rolling around perfectly at our BPM with the original pattern, but we haven't had to pitch it up or time stretch it or anything. This is kind of a technique where you can warp your breaks to your song tempo just through kind of editing them, and actually is just going to chop off the ends of all the audio regions to make it fit. The next thing I want to do in Logic is actually come in, and this is a bit of a weird thing. You've got to go into zones, and then you can't even see this by default. You've got to go View, Zone List, and click Sample. And what Logic does, for whatever reason, is it puts these fades, automatic fades, in at the start, the end of the samples, but it will actually make your break sound a little bit gated and choppy. So you don't want that either. That's a really annoying feature. And then the last thing I do is actually usually pitch the Amen up a little bit. What's cool here is I can kind of so 3 semitones is sounding pretty good to me, and then we've got a nice Amen rolling around at our song BPM. One of the main reasons I chop my breaks in this way and go through all that effort to warp the MIDI and follow this kind of workflow is because I get a groove template of the Amen break at my song BPM. This means that I can actually see the placement of the shuffles, and you can see the original groove of the Amen coming through here. And a very common technique is to quantize your kicks and snares of the break, but then leave the shuffles a little bit looser or leave them in their original positions. And so whenever I want to use these shuffle bits, I can actually take them, and if I hold Shift and drag them, Logic should snap to somewhere very similar to the original placement of where they were. So whenever you rearrange your breaks, you can then preserve some of the original groove that was in them. Probably the first and most obvious thing people were doing back on the day when they first got their hardware samplers was chopping up the breaks and rearranging the grooves. When we look at the Amen break, it's got multiple kicks in. I think it's got another one, another kick up here. It's got multiple snares in as well. And so you can basically move all of these hits around and resequence whatever hits were in the original break. Another really cool trick people were doing would be to take an individual hit from a break, like a snare drum in this instance, and then pitch that up and down. When we look at the way this break has been mapped in Logic, you can see each of these kind of zones here is representing one instrument or one chop of the break, and then that's responding to one key on the MIDI keyboard. But when you want to pitch something up and down, if I come to this snare instrument, you basically need to highlight one snare. So I've just got the snare selected in this kind of start and end range here, and then I've spanned the snare all the way up and down across the keyboard. And that's going to allow you to pitch it up and down by itself. A slightly more experimental and less common variation of that pitching technique is actually to pitch around the whole break. And so rather than just selecting a snare, this time I've selected the break and let it roll on from that point to the end of the whole kind of sequence. What you've got to remember here is that as multiple hits are going to be playing, when you pitch up and down, it's going to throw off the tempo of the break, and that's going to sound really weird at your BPM. But what you can do is go an octave lower, so 12 semitones lower is going to play the break at half the speed, and then you get this really cool hip hop rhythm come through, as opposed to being the break at drum and bass speed. Now, I couldn't really do reversing justice without diving into Renoise and showing you how cool the backwards or reverse command is in this tracker style of DAW. And for those who don't know, whenever you see the B00 command, it's like a track effects, is going to make whatever note it's landing on, it's going to make that play in reverse. Now, what's so cool about Renoise is I can also choose, if you look at this ruler on the bottom, I can basically detail exactly where I want it to reverse from. And so you can create really cool whip back snare effects, I'm sure you'll hear, and things like that. You also have this other thing where if you play a note like this one here, it will play forwards, and then when it hits a backwards command, it will play backwards, and then we essentially have a forwards command, which is B01, and then it will play forwards again. So I can probably very quickly show you. I'm also combining this with a pitch effect, so the break is pitching down as this reversing is happening, which creates an almost like a turntable stopping style effect. Anyway, so reversing is really, really cool in Renoise. Gating is another trick I use all the time, and it's very simple in a DAW like Logic or Ableton. You essentially just shorten the MIDI notes or pull them in a little bit. But in Renoise, it's maybe a little bit more complicated, where we have to use this thing called a cut command. So the C00 command, or CXX, is the cut command. And what I'm basically saying here is I want to cut on this line, and I'm going to cut to 0, so cut to no volume. And then the 6 is telling Renoise how long it's going to let that line play for before it chops it off. And what you do is you get these really cool stuttering effects, which I think sound really dope. Of course, we also have the classic AKAI style stretch effects. Now, you can go and spend some of your hard-earned cash and get an old hardware sampler and go through all the faff of using one of them. But I would highly recommend using Amigo plugin. I think it's only about 10 quid. And I did a comparison in a video a couple of months ago, where I sort of did a AKAI versus Amigo off on the stretching, and it was very close. I mean, you might get 5 or 10% more authentic stretching in the AKAI, but I think they've done an amazing job with Amigo, and it's just a great plugin overall. So I would highly recommend that for getting your classic AKAI stretch effects. One technique I think is quite underused actually is drum rolls, and everyone knows to put a big drum roll before a drop or to build energy, but actually having these little drum flourishes in the middle of your passages can go pretty hard. And the trick with this is really just to use velocities, and so I've just done a low to high ramp with these kick drums here to create this little roll in this break section. Okay, wicked, so we're back in Logic quickly, and I just want to touch on quite a complex topic that's a bit of a dark art, and that is drum hit layering. Now, drum hit layering is one of those things that can give you amazing results, but can be a bit of a mad science, and often is a lot about trial and error more than anything. But I have been playing with this new plugin by Cable Guys called Snapback. And I'm not promoting this plugin in any way, I'm not endorsed by it, but I do think it's amazing for layering up your breaks. Probably the most important thing when you're doing a drum hit layering is sample selection, and you can really be fighting and processing the wrong sample and spend ages and ages on it, when actually just getting a better sample in the beginning makes all the difference. And what's really handy in here is if you come into this section, you can actually load your own user samples. So I gave a lot of these out to my patrons quite recently. All of these sort of kicks and snares which are perfect for layering, which I've chopped from breaks and all over the place really. But just being able to tab through all of these results makes such a difference to quickly finding the snare drum that you want or the kick drum you want. The other important things to consider when doing your drum hit layering are firstly the amplitude envelope. So the way this snare in this instance is decaying over time, and being able to shape that is really handy with this decay control. So you can basically control how snappy it is. And then also the tuning. So quite often you need to pitch up or down your layers to fit better with the main break. And if I show you this example here, that's what it originally was at. And this is often something you do by trial and error, literally just listening to the layer like I'm doing here in a loop and just pitching it around as you go. And then the last thing that's really important with your drum hit layering, which I'm really happy they included, is this shift or the phasing. And this is essentially the way the two layers are aligning, and being able to subtly offset the way the two snares are aligning can really help. Obviously, if you go too far, you get flamming, but actually just by slightly offsetting the phase, you can get some very different results with your layers. So the greatest thing about Snapback is it's just put all of these sort of fundamentals of drum hit layering in one plugin with very sort of easy to access UI. Now I haven't even really used the Snapback part of it. I've just been using this transient layering part, and so even without the Snapback part, I think it's an amazing plugin and I would highly recommend checking it out. In addition to drum hit layering, we also have break layering, and I view these as slightly different things, even though a lot of the same principles apply. What I have here is an amen break. Just rolling around. This is actually the one we processed earlier, and then I've also layered this up with an Apache. And what I've done here, and this is something you will quite often do in break layering, is create quite similar rhythms with the two breaks. You don't always want them to be sort of juxtaposed, the two rhythms against each other, because it can sound really chaotic. So sometimes you want to do more like a combo break where you're having them, most of the kicks and snares are aligning on the same points. And so you're really just enhancing the original amen break here. Just to quickly show you a few things, with this Apache layer, very similar to the drum hit layering, I've pitched it up 5 semitones, so we've gone all the way to 5 semitones up. And once again, you do this whilst listening to your amen, kind of program it first and then fine tune some of these settings later. You can hear once you get to 5 semitones up in the Apache, they just sort of align much better and sit in a much better frequency range together and just combine in a better way. That's all you're really trying to do, is just trial and error until they sound like they're working better together. Now, another really important thing I do with this break layering is actually to pull in the decay of this amp envelope here, and this is going to make the Apache more snappy. So you can hear there's a lot of room sound coming through, but you can make it more snappy, and that generally helps a little bit with your layering to not have the sounds ringing out so much sometimes. So if I play them together, it just sort of cleans up the two breaks together a lot more. Okay, so we're back in Renoise now, and now we're going to talk about break swapping. Now, one of my favourite tricks to do with break swapping is actually to swap from the same break to another version of that break with different processing on it. And in this example, I've basically just smashed the break in this one track with a decimal with a really high preamp, so lots of saturation. And then you interchange between the two breaks at different times. And then finally we have break swapping, where you swap from one break to another. Now this is very often done in the last sort of bar of an 8-bar section as a fill, but you can create a really cool interchange between lots of breaks, and both Photek and Paradox are amazing at this. And sometimes you want one break playing and then the other one playing, and then sometimes it's cool to have them playing sometimes different rhythms over the top of each other, and you can get really complicated with this whole thing. So the challenge is almost always about making the breaks make sense, even when you're doing all of this sort of complicated swapping. To have some sort of rhythmic coherence to the whole thing, I think, is the most important thing. Now that we've covered a lot more of the classic techniques and the more well-known ones, I thought it'd be really cool to throw a segment in here where I show you some of my own favourite break effects techniques. And the first one I want to start with is something a lot of people have probably heard me do by now, is these mono reverb snares, actually gated mono reverb snares. So I'll play you a little example and then we'll dive in how to make these. So this is it in isolation. And it just adds a lot of emphasis on that note. So all you got to do to make these is go to your original break and find the snare. Find the snare drum and copy that to a new instrument. And I've got to pitch this up a bit. What's this actual 3 and 90? So let's get it going at the same tuning as the other break. And then what I actually do is create a new track in Renoise, and then at the top of this track just put in this note. So we have the snare drum in there, and then I can go, I actually made a preset. And you can use plate reverbs for this and things like that, but I actually just love using Round by Native Instruments. And the only thing you've got to have on this BX control is just allowing me to mono the sound after the reverb. What I can then just do with these macros is choose how kind of big I want that reverb sound to be, and then I just print this sound out. And this will give me a new sample and then normalize this. So I have the mono reverb snare perfectly in here. Now what's cool about these, I can actually delete this track, is in Renoise these lanes are monophonic and by default. And what I mean by that is whenever a new note hits on this lane, it will chop off the previous one. So this snare will play from this point all the way down, but when it hits this note, it's going to cut off that snare, and that's where the gated part of this thing comes from. So the gated mono reverb snare is getting cut off by the next note, and so you have this big kind of release of sound, and then it gets swapped away by the next note, and I think that just gives you a really cool effect. What I've also done in Renoise is be a little bit cheeky here and do one of those backwards commands again. So this actual sample is just whipping back at the end as well, just to give a cool little kind of bit of expression back into that next note. One other trick which is so simple to implement but so effective is to send your drum bus to a dotted eighth note delay. And if I just show you an example of me doing it here. You can create lots of, it almost sounds like you're making drum fills or something. It just works really well. The dotted eighth note rhythm for drum and bass in general is such a good delay time, but this is such an effective way of adding a bit of spice to your drum breaks without actually having to do too much. All you got to do is automate that send effect coming on and off, and you get really great results. This next one is actually a little bit of a sneaky trick, and what it is making ghost snares from your snares. So all I've done here is I'm programming a note in with less velocity, and I'm also cutting it quickly. So I'm making it quieter and then cutting the ends off to making it a bit shorter. And then what you got to do is put these on the offbeats. And in Renoise it's really simple. Any of the odd numbers, so 11, 13, 15, they're going to be offbeats. And you can see in this passage where I've kind of put these shuffle notes here, but you can almost put them anywhere. If I play this one and then maybe I'll fill it in even more with more shuffles, I can show you can pretty much put these on every offbeat and it will sound really cool. Yeah, so maybe I do it in this one here, and I'll just solo the breaks so you can hear. So we have all these places I can come and put them in, maybe at these points here. Also, that one sounded a bit weird. Maybe I'll get rid of... That was perfect. So it's these little bits of expression, but you don't realise how important these shuffles are to the groove in drum and bass. I think the reason that Amen's so popular and the Funky Drummer is because of they have all these really good ghost note combinations in there. Another great, really simple trick is to put a kick drum, a slightly lower velocity kick drum, on the last eighth note of a 4-bar or an 8-bar passage. And I call this a roll-on kick. I'm not sure what its actual name is, but all it does is it gives you this sort of bounce into the next bar and a little bit more kind of rolling progression from one 4-bar passage to the next. Otherwise, sometimes everything can sound a little bit too kick snarey, and I think having these kicks just bouncing into the next bar actually makes a lot of difference sometimes. So that like dun dun to get you back in really helps to keep things kind of rolling from one bit to the next. My journey on YouTube diving into all these techniques in this style of music really began with breaking down Photek, and there was one technique of his I could never quite figure out, and that was these snare rattles or snare rolls. But they're not just a standard velocity roll, it never sounds authentic enough or the way he did it. What I think is happening, and I will happily be proved wrong, but this is the closest I've ever been able to get to it, is to take a snare like this and to essentially create a loop point. Now with the loop point you actually have to offset the start and end markers a little bit from the main transient, and then you get this rattling snare. Now the other things you've got to do is use some kind of volume envelopes as well as a bit of a volume LFO, just to make it sound a little bit less robotic and give it a little bit of movement over time. It sounds a little bit weird in isolation, but they go pretty hard if you put them in the right place in your tune. And the one other thing I've done here is layer this rattle with one of those reverb snares. I think I've turned it down in velocity, the reverb snare, and then I have the rattle coming in a little bit after the transient, which I've done some volume automation with. So it's a little bit technical to get these to sound right. But they do, this is the closest I've got to his technique, and I did a Patreon video a while ago where I sort of really broke this down, and it's probably explained it a lot better than I have today. So you can check that out over there on Patreon. In the same way I learned a huge amount from diving into Photek and studying how he used to make music, I also learned a huge amount from Paradox and studying his workflow and techniques. And one of my favourite of his was the way he would put a high cut or a high pass filter on a break. So cut away the low end from a break and then replace the same position of the kick drum. You replace it with a fat kick of your own. So I've got a kick drum here, which I've really overly saturated as well. So you have this kind of fat, weighty, subby kick under your high pass break. The last technique I quickly want to talk about here is something called gate tempo, and this was one of my first and probably proudest discoveries I've had on this channel. I didn't invent this technique. I actually think it probably came about in the early days of Recycle, maybe Recycle 2.0, where people were loading drum sounds or slices of breaks onto their hardware samplers and then having the MIDI regions still in their DAWs. But I'll quickly show you how to set this up. All we do is follow the same break chopping process I did in the beginning, where you slice a break at all the hits and then you convert it to a new sampler track, and then you remove the fades from the sampler track. Trim the MIDI up to perfectly match the length of the audio, and then you can warp it once again, the MIDI, to fit with, say, like a 2-bar section in this example. The whole idea with this technique and why it's so handy is because when you slice a break up at all the hits, it's no longer tempo dependent. What I mean by that is I have this break here, this is kind of just looping around. But what I can do is I can change my BPM and it would still loop around perfectly. Or I could go to something like 225. So you can change your BPM. You can also come into the sampler and I can change the tuning of the break. And I can do that live if I want and automate it in a track. Another thing I love to do is change the decay. So you can do all of these things live, which is so cool, but when you slice a break into longer segments, you can't do that because the hits all start to pitch up and down and throw off the tempo of the break. So this is one of the real benefits, is you can be a bit more creative when you slice all the individual hits of the break using this technique. Now, when it comes in really handy is when you want to layer up multiple breaks. And once I've done some more break layering here. So I've got this break, this kind of Dennis Coffee break running, and then I've got the Sandman running underneath it. But I think if I come into the Sandman, I've pitched up and I've messed with the decay. So just the same way when I was talking about break layering before, just messing with the tuning and decay of the layers can really help you fine tune things together. So it's amazing for break layering because you get a little bit more control of how you can manipulate those two breaks to work together. I've then taken those two breaks and made one more example track, so loads of examples I'm throwing at you today, but I wanted to show a little bit more about percussion layers. So I'll just play you a little example here, but what I'm going to first show you is about shakers and hi-hats. And one of the main reasons you're going to want to use shakers and hi-hats on top of your drum breaks is to add energy and a sense of progression to a song. And so hopefully you can hear when they come in, it's not always something that wants to be super noticeable, but it's going to pick up the energy of the track a little bit. The obvious thing I think everyone knows about when programming percussion like this is to use velocities to create a sense of rhythm. So you're not just hearing the same note at the same level repeating over and over again. Another thing I'm often doing is using a sample of a shaker and then playing with the sort of start time, maybe putting a little bit of a fade in. I can see playing with the amp envelope a little bit here just to shape that sound. And in this instance, I really didn't want the shakers or the hi-hats to be overpowering the break. They just wanted to sit there in the background and sort of merge in and fit underneath them. And another thing that's really important to help you do that is actually a bit of processing on them. And what I almost always find when I'm putting one shots in or percussion layers in with old breaks is they sound too bright and modern and digital. And so I will use this plugin RX950 to reduce the bandwidth on them almost always. If I just show you before and after maybe. It's just made it a little bit duller and damper. And it's only a little thing, but it does actually make a big difference just to sort of merge these and camouflage them a little bit more under the main breaks. Another really cool trick is, as well as messing with the velocities, is to mess with things like pitch, very subtly modulate the pitch, or the amp decay is another favourite of mine. And the cool thing about the decay is it means each note is not going to ring out as long as the previous one, and that's actually a little bit more realistic sometimes. So some are going to be a bit more snappy than others, but it just gives a nice touch and creates a bit more realism in these percussion layers. And I've got the hi-hat pan to one side and the shaker on the other, just to make a little bit more of a fuller sound. But there's nothing too special going on there. They're just sort of filler or pulse elements. And generally with the shakers and the hi-hats, with drum and bass or jungle, I go for like an eighth note rhythm, which is what's happening here. So just a steady, straightforward eighth note rhythm. And I haven't even done any sort of swing or anything like that. But then with the rides, actually, I sometimes find if the ride is on too straight a rhythm, it sounds a little bit boring with jungle. And I often go for a quarter note rhythm, which is more like this. Which, if you listen to it with the breaks, it sort of emphasizes more what's happening with this two-step jungle kind of beat. The ride plays along with it a little bit more, so I think that's often a little bit more interesting with the ride. All I really want to show in this last section here is that you can have quite a simple repetitive rhythm with your main drum breaks, where I just have a 4-bar loop repeating over and over again. But then you can add a lot of depth with your percussion layers, and I've got sort of bongos, a whole bunch of metallic hits and cymbals and things coming in. I've also got some Foley layers, like some Kung Fu slices, some Kung Fu hits and sword slices and things like that. And sometimes they can sound a little bit out of place, so you've got to be a little bit nuanced in the type of sounds you go for. But you can have simple kind of rhythms and main beats and then spice it up with all these percussion layers. It's a great way to add interest to your beats. Okay, so that might have to wrap up for today. I am absolutely rinsed. I think I did a 4.5 hour session yesterday, and I've done just about 4 hours today doing this recording. So my brain, I can hardly even talk trying to get the words out. But I hope I've done it justice. I put so much work into all the kind of demos for this track and writing the script and everything. And I was just sad to sort of lose a really good recording yesterday, but I think I've done pretty good today and I've brought it back. So I'm excited to get this video out. I've got a couple of days editing now over the weekend, and then it's Christmas really. So yeah, thank you for everyone for sticking with me this year. It's been another sort of, I can't even tell you, I think I looked at the other day on my YouTube and I've gone up maybe 8,000 or 9,000 in the last year of my span. So it shows you it's really slow to start with, and then it sort of starts to ramp up. And it's really thanks to all of you for supporting me and watching my videos. So yeah, big ups to everyone and Merry Christmas, and I will catch you next year with lots more jungle content. Big ups, peace.